Alright, hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Surgical Instruments Explained. Today I'm going to do a little something different. I'm kind of excited about this video. I'm not highlighting an instrument exactly, but more of an implant device that we use in certain hip fractures. I've been doing this for a while now, and this has been one of my favorite procedures to scrub. I do both scrub and circulator roll, and as a scrub, this has always been one of my favorites. And I think that's just because it kind of makes sense to me. It has a nice flow to it. The surgeons I work with enjoy doing this procedure. It's something that usually goes very smooth. And what it is the TFN for hip fractures. So it's a trochanteric fixation nail. Kind of a mouthful. TFN is a lot easier to say. And this is what it is. This one is an example of what's called a short nail. And we'll get into all the bits and pieces here, but they come in different sizes. You got short, intermediate, and long nail. To give you an idea of what a long nail looks like, this is a long nail compared to the short. And there's different uses, different reasons why you use different lengths, and we'll kind of get into that later in the video. To give you a little bit of background on the TFN, this was first started being used in, I believe, 1988 with hip fractures, and it can be used on several different types of fractures, like I was saying, and we'll get into that with one of our sawbones. We'll talk about where the fractures are and when you use short versus long nail. So the short nail started being used in, I believe it was 1988. The long nail came into use in 1992, and they're still very popular today. We use these all the time for hip fractures. There's advantages to them. You can get up and be weight bearing right away. And so going forward, we'll get into it. I'll show you how these are used. Stay tuned. So before we get into how the nail works and what it does, I'm going to explain some anatomy on the femur here and just kind of let you know what I'm talking about when it comes to the fractures. So this is an example of a left femur, and we're looking at it as if we were looking at the person. So you have the femoral head here. This is the neck of the femur, the femoral neck. This is the greater trochanter, and then back here is what's called the lesser trochanter. And with the different types of fractures, they're just defined as where they are. So if it's below the trochanter here, it's going to be called a subtrochantic or subtrochanter fracture. If it's on the femoral neck, I think it's just called a femoral neck fracture. And if it goes between the trochanters, it's called pertrochanteric or intertrochanteric. And if it's subtrochanter or a shaft fracture, this would be the shaft of the femur, they're going to use the long nail because that's going to give them better fixation and better support for that particular type of fracture. If it's going to be a femoral neck fracture or I believe intertrochanteric fracture, they're going to go with that short nail usually, and that's going to provide adequate support for the fracture. Now, one advantage to this system is that it can allow for compression. If it's a femoral neck fracture, they can pull that back together with the instrumentation that they use to insert this nail. But kind of getting ahead of it here, we'll go into the parts of the TFN, and then I'll show you how it actually gets inserted. Okay, so the start of the procedure, the first thing they need to do is find the canal of the femur, and they do that with a guide wire going in through the top of the femur. Now this one has already been drilled out, but they'll go in with using fluoroscopy, so X-ray. They'll use a guide wire to go down the top portion of the femur, and then from there, once they have location on X-ray, they'll ream that out to allow for an opening for the nail. Now, if they're doing a long nail, they need to do reaming the entire shaft of the femur. So they'll use sequential reamers going up in size each time till they get good chatter, I guess is the best way to define it. You just kind of know it when you hear it as far as what size they want. And so with a long nail, they'll ream the entire shaft of the femur, but with a short nail, they don't need to do that. And then when the short nail goes in, it's on a device that this mounts to. It's got this whole big arm that comes out and around, and this just is going to slide in just like so into the femur. And well, it doesn't slide in like so, they hammer it in a little bit. Now for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just using my home pliers and whatnot, but you can see here this one's already drilled out as well, but normally that wouldn't be there. You'd have to, once you get this in and where you want it, you're going to then use a guide wire to go through the outside of the femur here. And again, there's a whole jig set up so they can find this pretty easily, but they're going to take another guide wire and go through the femur up here up into the femoral head, and then they can measure off of that wire to see what size helical blade they're going to use. And that's what this is. This is the helical blade. This can also come in a screw, whereas this would be more like a screw than what it is here. This is definitely more commonly used than the screw. And so this is going to slide into the femur. Again, not really sliding in, but getting malleted in. And I'll show you what that looks like. Alright, so you can see we have the nail in there. It's lined up, and that's how it sits on the top of the femur. Now the helical blade, again, this is all on a jig, and that's one of the things I like about this procedure is the instrumentation, the way it all fits together and works together, and it's just like I said, it has such a nice flow to it. So this helical blade goes on a handle, and it screws in here, and what that does is just going to slide in, and they'll use a mallet at the end of the handle and tap that into place. I'm just using my claw hammer. And this is what it's going to do. It's going to go into the femoral head. Now this is where they have to be careful. They want to make sure that measurement was good because they can't go into the cortical bone. You definitely don't want to cause any more damage. So they're going to mallet that in to where they need it. And then that locks in place. Now this is where they can do that compression if you want, because that'll pull back on that femoral head, giving compression if there's a femoral neck fracture, and then they can lock that in. And again, I'm just using one of my Allen wrenches, and they're going to lock that together with that screw that's right down in there. And that locks the whole thing together. Okay, so once the nail is in place and the helical blade is locked in, the last step is to put in what's called a distal locking screw. And you can see where this one lines up. There's a hole already in the femur because this was used at work as a practice. And then it lines up with the hole through the nail. And this is to keep it from rotating in the bone. And the long nail also has it down at the very distal tip. And the neat thing about this too is that with the long nail, it's side specific. So you have to make sure that you in fact have a left if you're doing a left femur, because the curve is such that it follows the shape of the femur. Not sure how well that curve shows up on camera, but so once the nail is in, the helical blade goes in, distal locking screw, that's it, you're done. Alright everybody, that's going to conclude today's video about the TFN. I hope you enjoyed watching it and found it informative. If you do have any questions or comments, please put them down below, and thanks for watching.